Well, next up, if she is here, I'd like to invite up AshleyZ.Hand, who's going to come up here and talk about, who's going to lead our next sort of panel on seamless mobility and public transport, with public transport leading the way. And so we've got another powerhouse group. I can't see it under the Klieg lights, but hopefully Ashley is ready to go. All right, I will exit to stage right. Come on, Ashley.
Good afternoon. So today we're going to talk about kind of how public transit is evolving. And I think one of the things that's really kind of interesting in this era of new technologies, new mobility, whether it's shared mobility, ride hailing, or micro-transit, everyone's talking about how this is a terrible time for public transit and that we're seeing these horrible headlines that range everything from mass transit is collapsing everywhere, falling ridership poses an emergency for cities, RIP transit will be dead in 12 years. This is a horrible story to be hearing. And the FTA, the Federal Transit Authority here in the United States, has reported a 2.5% decline in transit ridership between 2016 and 2017. And yet, there are more than 34 million boardings every weekday in the United States, culminating in 10.2 billion trips in 2017 in the US alone. And as we heard from the city of Mexico City earlier, there's an incredible number of people that depend on public transit to move around in our increasingly urbanizing environments. So, public transit serves some of our most vulnerable communities. So how do we ensure that we evolved public transit for the 21st century in the context of all of these new modes? This is truly an issue of equity and opportunity that we must be sure to be cognizant about as these things are continuing to evolve. So today we have a really great group of people to talk with, to hear from both the public and private side of this issue. We have JoshuaL.Schank, who is the Chief Innovation Officer for LA Metro, Alvaro Ramos from Moya, and we have Michael Hurwitz from Transport for London. So let's talk a little bit about what public transit looks like in the 21st century. How is kind of the traditional understanding of what transit is changing in your cities? We'll start with you, or a region, Joshua, as you cover all of LA County.
Right, yeah, so we as you probably know, LA Metro represents the 88 cities in LA County, and our organization is committed to trying to figure out many, many different ways of achieving our ultimate goal, which is getting fewer people to drive alone, right? And we are not married to any specific method of doing that, right? I think that a lot of times this problem is framed for transit agencies as one of ridership, right? That for a transit agency to be successful, you have to get more people riding on transit. Well, we're an unusual agency because we're not just a transit agency, we're also the transportation planner and funder for LA County, and we are responsible to voters for much more than just getting people to ride mass transit. The reason that voters gave us, with 71% of the vote, a full cent tax increase indefinitely is because traffic here is terrible. And they wanted us to do something about it. And building mass transit is part of the solution. But much more than that is thinking about what are the different options that we can offer that will allow people to not have to drive alone and still achieve what they want from a mobility perspective, and what are the prices that we have to charge to get people to not drive alone that will make it possible for them to make different choices. So it's both carrots and sticks, as many options as we can, not limited to mass transit, and as well as the penalties for not choosing one of those better mobility options.
And Michael, in London, there's a considerable percentage of people that rely on public transit. How do you think your vision of how transit is evolving has changed in light of all of these new competing technologies?
Well, cities are different. Like, it felt really different getting here from the airport, traveling around. And you mentioned the percentages in London. We already have 65% or so of trips are not in the car.
Compared with?
Yeah, we're about 5%. Yeah.
So it's a different environment.
Yes.
And in the city of London's density and topographical situation, geography, it just makes a lot of sense for people. if you think about like new capacity, you make big structural interventions. We're finishing now. I think it's the biggest infrastructure project in Europe right now, the Crossrail, the Elizabeth line, and that's going to be trains every 110 seconds, 200 meters long, carrying 1,500 people. And you just can't compete. There will never be a better option to get across the city, east to west, than that.
Yep.
And it's similar to what Joshua was saying. If people have an option that is inherently more attractive, is potentially more seamless, and gets them where they want to go quicker, then that will become the obvious choice. And that's the most powerful thing you can do on behavior change, to make the choice an easy one.
And Alvaro, can you talk a little bit about what Moya is and kind of how you're thinking about partnering and working with cities to think through kind of what the 21st century model of transit is?
Yeah, so Moya is a company of the Volkswagen Group. We are in charge of mobility services, very much focused on microtransit and autonomous solutions for cities. And I'm so glad to be actually in between representatives of these two wonderful cities, because they're actually a great reference of how things should be done in new innovative projects. We are a traditional car manufacturer, which is facing also a transformation the same way that cities are. And it is a painful transformation for us. And there's a lot of doubts what is the right way to go. And I really enjoy how LA Metro and TfL are facing this transformation with private companies like us, startups and large corporations. And I'm just looking forward for the conversation today.
Well, so Citify, the company that I'm co-founder of, we have been working on just kicking off some initiatives to look at the future of autonomous vehicles and how communities can shape kind of the future of technology. Does that really make a difference when you look at working with cities closely? Are you kind of in an environment where you have a business model and you're trying to figure out how to make it fit for a city, or are you really actively engaged in co-creation?
We are going all the value chain. So we go from vehicle design all the way to customer interaction, And so, for instance, vehicle design is extremely complex. It takes about 5 years from decision making to actually having a vehicle out there. And right now, all ride-hailing and all ride-pooling and even autonomous solutions are still using retrofitted vehicles that are designed for ownership. The total cost of ownership, the customer interaction are not optimized for urban pool mobility. So this is something that we need to engage cities with. So we are not just coming with a standard vehicle and trying to do something short term. We really want to have a long-term view and long-term engagement with cities, because if we get wrong an investment into design and development of a vehicle is $1 billion investment. So if we get it wrong, it's not only bad for the cities, it's also very bad for us.
And Joshua, you've been experimenting with thinking about extending what public transit actually means in LA as a whole. Bike share, for example, was introduced not as a kind of add-on to a system that cities own. There's 88 cities in the county of LA, but really as an extension of Metro. Can you talk a little bit about other kind of models that you're looking at, including the mobility on demand?
Sure. So the way that we look at it at Metro is that there is a major change that has already taken place. People often talk to the innovation officer. They think that our job, and Michael, I don't know about your experience, but they often think, well, my job is to look 10 years in the future and figure out how we adopt the technology that doesn't exist yet. But that's actually not our job, because we're responsible to people right now for doing things that will make a difference in their lives immediately. So we're looking for technology that actually exists. And the main thing that has changed in the last 10 years is the invention of the smartphone. That has changed transportation pretty much more than anything else. And that technology exists, and in fact has been in use by the private sector for a long time now, relatively speaking, to connect people to vehicles more effectively. And so we are now experimenting in two different ways to find out how can we connect our passengers to vehicles more effectively, since that's something that we should be doing, right? The existing customer experience with respect to procuring a vehicle which are mostly buses on our network, is not necessarily all that easy. It's not easy necessarily to pay for it. You don't necessarily know when it's coming, where it's going, all this. Whereas compare that to Uber or Lyft, where your customer experience is very intuitive. You know exactly when your vehicle's coming and you know where it's going. So we're experimenting in that with two different projects. One is Mobility on Demand, which will be a first and last mile service to 3 of our stations, where people who currently cannot use transportation network companies, namely people without smartphones, people who can't afford it, people who are disabled who cannot use transportation network companies, will now have access to one for 3 of our stations. And that might be a way to increase transit ridership simply by partnering with a transportation network company, in this case a company called Via. So that's the type of experimentation that we have to undertake in order to figure out how to be competitive in the new mobility landscape.
And when you think about how you measure the success of something like that, is it purely just ridership? Or are there other metrics in order to understand the shift towards other options that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you have to have people use it or else it's not useful, right? So that is kind of a given. But the other issue is it financially sustainable, right? Because there's a reason that we use buses that are standard sizes to operate on our fleet, because we have standard ways of maintaining them and standard ways of storing them and standard ways of operating them that all reduce cost. And so when you introduce new types of vehicles and when you introduce new technologies, then that brings added complications. So whether we can make it financially sustainable is another critical issue. And then I think that the key thing we can learn from this goes back to the issue of customer experience. What happens when we start treating our customers as if they are very valuable commodities that we have to compete for, rather than giving them the basic service that we have to provide? Those are two very different things. And I think one of the things we hope Metro can learn from these experiments is when we really focus on customer experience, when we make that the top priority for our services, how does that change how people interact with and feel about Metro?
Enter transportation happiness. Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about how Transport for London has really focused in on that customer experience?
Yeah, for sure. There's two lenses I want to talk about. The first is the genuine priority that we give to customers. You know, I get to have the innovation title. I don't know about you. I spend more time worrying with the innovation in my title, but we have a director of customer. Yeah, and it's ingrained. All parts of the network have somebody responsible for, firstly, doing insight and research, so basing it on some science, but actually trying to do things to ensure that our brand is consistent, that the customer experience is seamless, that we have a fully accessible service, and we have, for all parts of the network, for what we do, you know, we run the tube directly, we specify all the bus services, we license taxis, sometimes we don't license taxis. You know, that process is really ingrained. We talk all the time about our customers, and we spend a lot of time researching how people come to trust us and come to value that experience. So that runs through everything. You know, we're currently in a process of letting a contract for our demand responsive bus trial, and we're doing it hand in glove with the customer team. So, for example, we have customer insight that says if you put a transfer on the side of a vehicle, you can't see into the vehicle, the person sitting in that vehicle can feel threatened. You know, if you're somebody late at night on your own in the vehicle, people like that you can see in. And it's that insight goes through everything that we do. I think the second thing I wanted to say, you asked before about metrics, is that for us, everything flows from the Mayor's transport strategy. We have this vision, talks about how we want transport to be in 2041. You know, we're already at 65%. Public transit and active travel, we're aiming for 80%. And we've set out the criteria by which we judge new mobility models. So I love a new mobility service if it can funnel people into a transport hub. I think it's fantastic if you can allow people who are less able to remain socially and economically active. I like it less if you're going to take 65 people out of a well-stacked London double-decker bus and smear them out into 50 pods. So, you know, those are the metrics. We're very clear about that, and the discussions we want to have with the innovators is, look, what can you offer? Because there will be fantastic capability and ideas and creativity in the market, but we want to work together to try and shape it so that it serves both their commercial and innovative interests and instincts, but also serves the needs of the city.
And Alvaro, what do you think the private sector can offer that kind of experience as an extension of public transit? And what is most exciting, do you think, in terms of helping to shift that behavior away from vehicle ownership into kind of this broader shared mobility model?
I mean, it is the transformation of the century for the OEM world. So for us, it's a completely different world. It's our clients suddenly have become the cities first, and then of course the citizens that the cities serve. But for us, it's developing this kind of new technology is a new area that we really don't know how to move forward. And you know, we were talking about the TfL microtransit solution, and Joshua was talking the same here. And there are still small projects, you know, with very big ambitions, but none of us really know how they're going to be operating. This is really truly serving a first last mile solution. Is it going to fulfill some gaps in mobility into the city? You know, how is it going to work? And the main thing is actually aligning the goals of the private companies and the public institutions on the sense of a very clear message. What you said is we should not take away from what is already working. And that is dangerous, and we really don't know what is going to be the reaction once this is scaled up and autonomous comes into the picture. We may run the risk of you know, endangering public transportation that is already working very well. And for that, we need to understand what the problems are, so we develop something that makes sense for the cities. And again, it goes all the value chain from the vehicle itself. That could be a 4-seat vehicle, it could be a 12-seater, it could be many things that we still don't even know. And yeah. So.
Well, I just have a question, because I'm so glad to hear you say that your intended clients are, you said cities, but I assume you mean public transit agencies as well. And because I think there is something interesting going on in the new mobility space, right? There are companies out there that are coming at this and saying cities and government are our clients, and there are others that are coming out there and saying, no, they're not our clients, they might be our partners, and we're going to say a lot of things that indicate that we have the same goals that they do. But of course, I mean, you're for-profit companies, and they're trying to make investment returns.
In some cases, they're completely bypassing and working around.
Yeah, just going right out there,
sector.
just throwing their services out there, and then the partnership comes later. And I think there's a very big difference in the potential outcomes of those approaches, and not necessarily more positive for the private sector, by the way, when they bypass the government, because when they just throw it out there and don't pay attention to what the potential public policy ramifications are, they just get hit with regulations that then can stay in place and be damaging for everybody. So going in with that, I really appreciate that you're going in with that partnership objective up front.
And the public agencies are often kind of limited in what they can affect. So in Metro's example, you have 88 cities and unincorporated county to cover. You don't usually manage the infrastructure that your services are running on. What challenges do you see because of that model? And then Transport for London has a very different model because you have been taking a very direct look at urban design and other elements around it. So maybe just talk a little bit about how that will help shift culture around public transit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is an enormous challenge that we are operating a transportation agency with 88 cities, so we don't have land use control. And the main problem in LA County in transportation, if you really think about it, right, is that we have a lot of public space devoted to vehicles, and almost none of that public space is devoted to vehicles that are carrying lots of people. Right? In London, you have a lot of space that you said, no, this is for, whether it's underground or above ground, this is for large vehicles carrying lots of people. We have very, very few. And so our job over the next 50 years is to try to secure more and more space for higher occupancy vehicles than are currently using that space, because there's way too many people driving alone and they're all waiting in line. That's what traffic is. And meanwhile, the bus full of 50 people is also waiting in line. So as we try to build out our bus lanes network over the next 10 years, which we, according to our strategic plan, we have committed to upgrading all of our rapid bus lines to BRT within the next 10 years. We have to have high-frequency bus routes with signal prioritization and exclusive lanes in order to be competitive. That's just has to be the first a priori thing we do. In order to do that, we have to work with 88 cities to make that happen, all of which are going to not want us to take a lane away of traffic in order to be successful. So yeah, it's a tremendous challenge, but we at Metro feel like if we don't take it on, no one will. Our boss often talks about filling leadership voids, and this is one of them.
And I don't mean to oversimplify the conditions that you're working in, because I understand there's a lot of complexity in London as well. So maybe speak to that.
Well, the first thing is, it works. You know, so we have bus lanes, and we already do the bus priority, and we actually specify and run and contract the bus network on metrics like excess wait time, reliability of the service, the headway between buses. You know, most places in London now, particularly on the high volume routes, you almost don't need to plan it. You can turn up and within a few minutes there'll be a bus. So, you know, it is the biggest carrier of passenger by mode in London, over 2 billion trips a year. But interestingly, it's declining slightly because a range of factors are coming into that that change people's decisions, one of which is another policy we have, which is open data. So for 10 years now, we've been making huge amounts of data available. We have over 70 APIs. One of those is our data from our iBus system, our intelligent management of the bus network. So I know I do it sometimes. If I'm looking on Google Maps or something like that, about where I want to go, it will give me a bus time. I know when it's coming and how long it will take. And it gives me a comparison about how long it takes to walk. And I'd say, do you know what, it's 2 or 3 minutes further to walk, I'll choose that option. So you make these structural interventions and you're starting in the right place, in my opinion. That has a huge benefit, but you need to give people choice. When we introduced the congestion charging regime, we spent a long time investing in the bus priority and the bus networks first, so that when the stick comes, you're not giving people like that zero-sum game. You're giving somebody another route, another choice. And back to that customer, you have to think about this from the traveling public, from the visitor, from the business. They need to have an option. And really that's probably the biggest learning of when you make those structural interventions from London's experience.
So there's a big question about whether or not public transit should be free. And if it were, how does that then tie into the private sector providing partnerships to extend the network for that last mile? And is that the right approach? Or what should cities and regions be thinking about in this space?
Well, I think the issue of what we charge for public transit has become really an albatross around the neck of public transit agencies. Because if you think about our fare structure, we have an incredibly complex fare structure, and we're just one of the municipal operators in LA County. There are many, many others that have their own fare structures. And we offer discounts for this and discounts for that, and you get a pass, you get a monthly pass, you can get it's like, it makes it more complicated than necessary, and at the end of the day, we're still not collecting a substantial amount of fare box revenue to really cut into our expenses. And I wonder sometimes whether a better approach might be to say that we're not going to bother with that anymore, and it is available to everybody. In order to do that, though, we would have to go back to the voters again and ask them for revenue, because we still need that revenue. It's not very much, but it's still there. But I love the idea that public transit is a thing that everyone can use at any time as much as they want, as long as they're paying their taxes. It sounds like a normal public utility that way, right? And I think it makes it so much more customer friendly when you do that than the current experience, where part of the challenge, frankly, of transit is figuring out how to pay for it in the first place.
Yeah, well, we can't afford to make it free. But it comes back to that point that what does the public see as a free utility? The way we're structured, we don't get any subsidy anymore operationally from central government, so we have to wash our own face. So we have to, love hearing about all the, going to voters and asking for all this money. Great, I'd love to do that. But we're not in that situation. But the thing that I would say is a powerful intervention that we have at our disposal is integrated ticketing. So there are, I think, 11 different bus companies operating, but all to the same standard. The buses look the only difference is the logo at the back of the bus. The payment system is the same. The information is shared in the same way. So it drives that consistency of experience, which I think is really important. The challenge is when we have companies such as Moya coming to us to say, how can we integrate with that? And that makes it an interesting conversation, but a challenging one.
Yeah, and I would also point out the fact that we are actually fully electric, so our deployment makes it more expensive and also more complex. We need infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and and of course it's a decision of the city, but it is actually right now at the point we are microtransit pooling solutions with 6, 8, 10 passengers in a vehicle, on top of it electric. It is extremely complicated to make it fit within the whole fare system of mass transit, but it's a work in progress, and it will be a city-by-city decision for sure.
Can I ask Michael a question though? To the fact, we wish we had the amount of revenue and ridership that you do, obviously, but how much of the revenue that you're able to sustain the network with comes from the congestion pricing charge versus fares from other folks?
A small fraction. So I think our total fare revenue is something like £4.5 billion a year. And I think from the congestion charge, it's like 300 million. So that's because the congestion charging area is quite a limited geography right now.
So one of the things that I hear a lot is that autonomy and autonomous vehicles are going to eliminate the need for the bus driver. I've talked to a few economists that kind of say, well, there's no way that there's a business model that would keep a bus driver in an autonomous vehicle. Maybe the role gets repurposed, but there's no kind of financial model that would support that. Do you agree with that? Is that a way to make that move towards autonomy?
Well, so I often tell the story when asked about autonomous vehicles, the unsolicited proposal process that we have in place. So, we've been accepting unsolicited proposals since February 2016. We've received over 120 of them. They come in rapidly. Our staff is overwhelmed by them, and there's lots of great stuff coming in. Not a single unsolicited proposal for an autonomous vehicle, autonomous bus, autonomous anything, not a single one. And I think the reason that has happened is that technology is not ready for prime time, and it is not ready for a public agency to use it for a mobility purpose. You can use it for a demonstration purpose and say, look at our whiz-bang technology, isn't that wonderful? But that's very different from serving a specific mobility purpose. Now, when you think about the public policy goal that you can accomplish with autonomy that is most important, I would argue that it's improving safety, right? That's a huge issue on Los Angeles city streets, and the extent that we can improve safety, that's a big win from a public policy perspective. So rather than approaching it as, well, we're going to get rid of bus drivers, which to me would not be a positive from a customer experience standpoint, no matter how well the vehicle drives itself. But I would approach it as, how do we help bus drivers, bus operators, operate the bus in a way that ensures greater safety? Because that's something we can actually do. And the technology is there now to try to start doing those things. So I think we often get caught up as natural human beings and like, what could be when the technology is there and it's so wonderful and won't that be great? But as public officials, we're responsible for dealing with things as they are today. And as they are today, the road system is unsafe, and there's technology that can improve that, and we need to be all over that.
Yeah, for us, the bus drivers are a really important part of actually managing the network. We have a really great system. I was in the control room last week on some operational duty, and you have bus drivers pressing the emergency button. They've seen something on the network. They become part of our eyes and ears out on the network. They're also responsible for that customer experience. We put all of our bus drivers through the Hello London program where they're taught how to improve the customer experience. But when people talk about connected and autonomous technology, they jump straight to robot taxis or robot buses. And in fact, the whole venture capital interest in this is overcome by this basic equation of take driver out of business model becomes hugely profitable. And of course, it's going to be much more complicated than that. But actually, on the journey to full autonomy, there's huge benefit. In London, we've just produced a new bus safety standard, which looks at not full autonomy, but augmentation and assistance. So we're looking now at automatic emergency braking on all of our buses, providing great awareness about pedestrian or cyclists in and around. The same science and the same technology can help us now before you get to a full autonomous model. And so I think there's going to be a long time before we remove the bus drivers. But there's one more thing I want to say. In Singapore, it's different. Singapore, because of the high standard of living there, they're struggling to recruit bus drivers. And they've said, maybe we can get robots to do that for us.
Yeah, but you read my mind. I was going to talk exactly about Singapore. Even you talk with city officials in Singapore and the public transportation in Singapore, and they are not looking for the cost-saving story. Safety is the first issue. They have a project right now for 2022 deployment of autonomous buses and autonomous shuttles. And if you ask them, what is their first concern? It really is safety, and the second concern is how, the bus drivers are going to transition to the new economy, but not in 2022. They're looking much later than that. There's so many things that the bus driver does beyond driving, and they're aware of it. And one of them, as you said, is totally related to safety.
One of my favorite examples is San Francisco has to reinstate elevator attendants because there were so many complaints about the cleanliness and security of elevators. So something that we automated decades ago, we are now humanizing because we realize there's a key function, and our cities are vibrant places of people, how important it is to have a human element. I mean, I can imagine in the era of adopting this technology, we're going to have to really start to think about what the kind of experience will be to get onto a vehicle that can drive itself, and it might be really alarming to not have somebody there.
Well, and also people with disabilities. How do you handle those kind of things? Emergencies of all types that are being we have not solved, and I don't think there's going to be a solution for many use cases. And we also have to be careful with equity. So we, serving part of the population with a different type of service, it's completely negative.
So if you were to kind of pick the top 2 incentives or behavioral sticks that we might have to shift towards more public transit usage, the context within which you are working is very different. What would you choose?
Well, we've outlined it directly in our strategic plan, Vision 2028. There are 2 main sticks that we call for. One, we have to look at congestion pricing for Los Angeles County in some form or another, whether it's through a pilot program initially and then spread it further, but we don't have much choice about that, right? It's either look into congestion pricing or just accept that traffic is going to get worse and worse forever and ever. So we've chosen look into congestion pricing. And then the second thing is the regulation of new mobility providers, because as private sector providers put more and more options out on the street, they, not all of them, but many of them do not have public policy goals front and center, right? But they are using public infrastructure that we're paying for with your tax dollars, right? So if we're funding this public infrastructure, these roads, and other people are generating profit by running services on them that have negative externalities for all of us, such as greater pollution, potentially greater congestion. Some people think that there are even negative externalities to bikes and scooters. So that's a different argument I'm not going to have today. But the point is that if they're using public infrastructure and there's generating a profit, there's an argument to be made the taxpayer deserves some of that back, and they deserve some of that back in a way that that in a way that accomplishes public policy goals. So it's not as, I don't think it's as simple as just levy a tax on all of them. It is levy a tax in a way that is intelligent enough to get those services to serve underserved communities, to make sure that those services are accessible to people who are with disabilities, to make sure that those services are safe. All the things that we care about in a public policy perspective, that's our opportunity to use that stick effectively.
Me next?
Sure, why not?
Yeah. So I agree on the first one certainly, and it's that point about customer choice. You know, some of those long burn infrastructure capacity, integrated pricing interventions. You need a system that people can engage with and that pushes and nudges people in the right way. So that there's that. I would frame the second angle slightly differently. It's about devising a way that you can have a constructive discussion about how to integrate those services. Because the trick here is to find, if you think of a Venn diagram, there are a set of duties and responsibilities that the city authority or the public transit provider has to the public. And that will include things like accessibility and inclusion that may not be supported by the profit motive. But on the other hand, whilst you have the profit motive from the innovator, they will have some great capability and creativity. So I think for me, it's to find a way that you can meaningfully test stuff, kind of do that deal to say, look, don't come and do it quickly. Don't do launch and defend. Let's have a discussion about what's the common ground. And for me, that would be the golden thread. If you can find a way of saying, look, don't come too quickly and let's talk about co-creating the future together.
Yeah, so for us, definitely the common ground is the key point that we are trying to achieve, you know. So where is it that we can bring something to the table that is useful for the city? What is it what kind of solution is truly needed? And we are looking at it in a very long term. Again, we are an OEM. It takes a long time to have vehicles adapted to the needs of a city. So we are not looking into deploying something and then pulling out, whether it's microtransit, electric, or autonomous. We're looking long term. And also, I think on both sides, and all of us have bosses, we need to understand that we're going to make mistakes along the way. You know, so be ready to pull back, and that's a little bit the situation we're in. Yeah.
You don't have a boss though, right? So you have more flexibility.
I do want to do a quick time check to see if there's time for a question from the audience. We do? Okay. Anybody have any questions? If not, I have more. Okay, good.
Thank you. Hi. Oh, sorry, that was loud. I've worked in offices in Los Angeles where they have programs where you can opt in at the beginning of the year, similar to insurance policies where you can pay, I believe it's 20% of a year pass, and you know, people will opt in the offices. Not everybody uses them, but they'll opt in. It gives them that option, and it also makes taking public transit more affordable for many of the people who are most reliant upon it. But I see that there's I guess it has to be so many people working in the office in the city for them to be eligible to opt in. Why don't they make that a citywide opt-in for all residents, and see if that will actually subsidize the cost of other people benefiting by the lower rates, and will also make it easier for more people to ride and encourage additional people to ride.
So,
Well, I don't know about the specific program you're talking about, but I can speak to two different things the Metro is doing along these lines. One, we are looking at a wholesale revamp of our fare structure. We've been talking already internally about some of the inefficiencies in the fare structure and how, in many ways, it is inequitable and needs to be revamped. So you're going to see a change coming, a proposal for a change coming to our board probably next year. But the second thing is that, I'm sorry, I'm trying to look out there and I'm being blinded, so I'll just go ahead and be blind. The second thing is that we're holding a forum on December 4th. There's been some ads going around about it, about how getting help in solving the traffic problem in Los Angeles, asking for potential solutions. And I've talked today about congestion pricing, and I think it is something we have to look at. But short of congestion pricing, there are other incentives that we can be offering, or we can work with employers to offer to get people to stop driving alone. And I know of one that's being implemented up in the Seattle area, where they're working with businesses to get people to carpool to and from different places. The more that we can get the business community engaged in trying to be part of the effort to get people to stop driving alone, whether it's by charging their employees for parking or providing cash incentives for employees to carpool or take transit, I think we'll be very successful. So if you're interested in being part of that solution, you should join us on December 4th as we think through those ideas and then accept unsolicited proposals on that area.
And I think there are other players too in creating those incentives. Health insurance providers, for example, thinking about the public health impact. Commuting by vehicle, by driving alone, is the most stressful way of commuting, and therefore, why not incentivize active transportation linking into public transit, which is greater for our environmental health of our cities, in addition to the individual health of commuters. Any other questions? Oh, let's got one here.
Yeah, sure. Chris Till. Just wanted to hear more about the Elizabeth line, Michael. Particularly, you said it's a massive infrastructure project. Was just interested, what have been some of the challenges with doing a project such as that, and how have you kind of overcome them at TfL?
Well, it's running a little late.
Yeah.
So, there's the engineering challenge, and actually the reason why we haven't opened it as soon as we were hoping to is something that's so important. That's going to be adding 10% capacity to the public transit network. We just got to make sure it's super safe, and it's signalling. And London is, the tube first opened in 1863. So tunnels were not designed with the modern train in mind, and so there's a huge technical engineering challenge. But actually, one of the most productive things that we've learned through that process is the principle of land value capture, and how we fund it is actually looking at taking both the businesses and the developers along the key nodes on that line. The values of those properties, the commercial opportunities for those properties goes up, and the financing of that is probably one of the key learnings. Is that there is something that you can use. You talk about transit-oriented development over here, and it works, and it has a genuine economic value, a demonstrable economic value that can actually be used to pay for the infrastructure in some instances. So I would say that's a really powerful learning that can be applied, I think, in many areas around the world.
And in Kansas City, which is a very small city compared to London, when they developed a streetcar, they had to cover the gap between federal funding through a taxing jurisdiction, which put the onus on property owners around the streetcar catchment area to fund it. The value of the property around the streetcar increased so much that the taxing jurisdiction actually considered refunding property owners money because they had more than what they needed to run the streetcar, which operates for free and throughout the downtown. Maybe talk a little bit about what's happening at Metro, because you are expediting a considerable amount of projects right now, really changing the kind of delivery model. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening there to kind of expedite the scale of the network?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure if most people are aware about how most major projects are delivered in the United States, but they're delivered in a way that enables the public sector to assume virtually all the risk for the project. So as a result, you see a lot of projects that are delivered either at higher cost than anticipated, or alternatively, they are delayed, or very commonly, as you're seeing with transit systems around the country right now, they are not adequately maintained, right? So we're trying to avoid that, and one of the ways that we're trying to avoid that is by introducing the public-private partnership model into project delivery. This is a model that is currently being employed in Los Angeles with the People Mover at LAX, It is a model that the UK pioneered and a model that Canada uses regularly when it deploys infrastructure projects. It's very common around the world, but in the US still remains rather scarce when it comes to public transit. What we're doing is putting every project we deliver, and there's a lot of them, $120 billion over the next 40 years, every project we deliver through a lens of how much risk should we be assuming on this versus how much risk can we transfer to the private sector. And that means bringing private sector financing in and having the private sector do the parts of this project that they're best able to assume the risk for. And we're hoping by doing that, we can account for the life cycle costs of the projects, we can reduce the overall cost of the project, and we can deliver those projects sooner.
So if you're eager to help LA solve its traffic problems, December 6th is the date?
December 4th.
14th, yeah. 4th, okay, well there you go. It's good to get the right date. Thank you so much, Joshua, Alvaro, and Michael, for your time today. Please give them a warm round of applause.